Okay, this is a brief review of Chapter 9, Constructing Gender and Sexuality. Okay, so the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably in our culture, but as sociologists, we differentiate between the two. So sex refers to an individual's membership in one of two biologically distinct categories, male or female, right? Again, a binary. And again, these things are often used interchangeably, but inappropriately, as gender means something different. Gender are the physical, behavioral, and personality traits that a group considers normal for male and female members. So what's interesting about sex is we tend to think of it as the one that's biological, and gender is the one that's socially constructed. But actually, in fairness, sex is also socially constructed, meaning that there isn't just male and female. There's also many people who are born intersexed. About 1 in 1,000 babies are born intersexed or hermaphroditic. So meaning that they might have some sort of abnormal chromosome makeup or mixed indeterminate male and female sex characteristics, which of course is actually biological. So meaning that when you're talking about different categories, when it comes to hormones, when it comes to chromosomes, you're really looking at about 5 different sexes, but we don't acknowledge that socially, right? When someone has a baby, we don't say, is it a boy or girl or other, right? We just say, is it a boy or girl? So we've really socially constructed sex in our society as well, even though being born intersex is actually more common than Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, though I'm sure you've heard of both of those things, right? But we don't really hear about intersexed people. So again, gender is more about the social definition of what it means to be a man or a woman. So it's the term that describes behaviors as either feminine or masculine, right? In our society, it's often expected that women will behave in feminine ways and men will behave in masculine ways. And of course, we know not all individuals fit this description or behave, with varying degrees of these things. But the societal expectation is that gender be a dichotomy instead of a continuum, which is much more what it actually is. So gender is, when you talk about gender as an identity, this is an individual's self-definition or sense of gender, while gender expression itself is a person's individual behavioral manifestations of gender. So when it comes to essentialist and constructionist approaches, essentialists basically say that gender is biological, that it's just a binary. You're either male or female. And that there's no such thing as gender, really, in a way that it's just biological sex, which we already talked about is socially constructed and actually is more than 2. But essentialists say, no, it's not. There's only 2. And just, if you point out hermaphrodites or any other chromosomal or hormonal variations, people just go, la, 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 cover their ears and tell you that there's only 2. Right? But obviously sociologists use a constructionist approach as they see sex, gender, and sexuality all as social constructs. So constructionists believe that gender is constructed or created through our interactions with other members in society. So in the US, we tend to classify people as being male or female, but other societies have different classification systems, some of which are mentioned in your textbook. And people are treated differently based on the norms associated with those systems. So for instance, queer theorists emphasize the importance of difference and reject ideas of innate identities and restrictive categories of gender and sexual identity. Right? This idea of heteronormativity, right, that we just assume that everyone is heterosexual, is something that's much more socially constructed from the Victorian era onward, as we didn't even have a word for heterosexual or homosexual until the medical texts of the late 1800s. So when it comes to some of these things, these are all just terms from your book, right? Sexual orientation is the inclination to be heterosexual, which means attracted to the opposite sex. And again, in a binary system that ignores the fact that other people have variations of sex. Homosexual, which is attracted to the same sex, or bisexual, which is attracted to either. Those who are asexual simply reject any sexual identity at all. I think that's the one that's the hardest for people to understand. And in the more modern nomenclature of these things, because of the presence of transgendered individuals and the more visibility and understanding of that community, we now have different terminology that kind of moves beyond heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, right? Like I'm sure you've heard of things like pansexual, which is basically just saying bisexual, but in the context of, instead of saying bisexuals will only be interested in a relationship with a man or a woman, that pansexuals are interested in a relationship with anyone, meaning even if they identify as transgender or non-binary. So we see how the culture changes, so the language and the understandings about gender and sexuality change to reflect that, right? So these things aren't static. The definition of women and men is not the same as it was 100 years ago, and it definitely isn't going to be the same 50 years from now, right? So it's something that's ongoing and changes as a reflection of the culture. So Kinsey's research is an important part of this point. So Kinsey did this, like, the most comprehensive research study on sexuality in the 1950s, and basically said that, and again, we think of the 1950s as kind of wholesome and pure when it comes to sexuality, but he found that sexuality was more diverse than what was commonly assumed. So his studies led him to believe that people were not exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, but fell along a wide spectrum. So he created this thing called the Kinsey scale, which you see at the bottom here, of sexuality, right? So kind of an example of what they call queering the binary, rejecting the binary sense of the heteronormative categories of sexuality, to say that you're not just heterosexual or homosexual, that you might be somewhere in between. Meaning if you've had any sort of same-sex sexual activities or desire, right, then you find yourself somewhere in this spectrum. And what's interesting is that a large proportion of people in the research study found themselves somewhere between 1 and 5, and not just at 0 and 6. And this was in the 1950s. So it really shows that when it comes to society, it tells us you believe this, you act this way, this is what's appropriate. But when it comes to people's actual innate and internal desires, the way that they understand the world and their own sexuality, it's a little bit more complex than these kind of black and white binary categories we like to create. All right, so obviously these are gender, sex, and sexuality are hierarchies. So all of these have, opportunities for inequality in society. Because as we talked about with the paper ball situation in Chapter 7, when you create a hierarchy, you preference one group as a hegemony or as the dominant group. And then all the other groups are then considered inferior, right, or less than in that same hierarchy. So despite a great deal of change in recent years, homophobia is still a common problem in American society. So again, the term homophobia just means fear of or discrimination towards homosexuals or towards individuals who display purportedly gender inappropriate behavior, meaning that gender and sexuality are very connected, because oftentimes if someone is not displaying a gender expression that we think is appropriate for their biological sex distinction, we assume it affects their sexuality, even though your gender, your sexuality, your sex, these are all separate things, right? But for most people, they do align. So that makes it confusing for some people to understand that what they have in their life is not what everyone has as far as their own identities. So gender inequality is something that can be seen in all past and present societies, and we could trace back to a lot of differences that came from colonization in early societies. So the activities that women could participate were limited, largely because of childbearing, and once you hit the Ice Age, it was harder for women to get enough iron in their diet in order to kind of supplant menstruation. So that meant that, this kind of hunter-gatherer dynamic started to kind of arise. And what's interesting is that when we look back at those societies, we tend to preference men within that hierarchy to say that the hunters are the most important, when the gatherers are the ones who are basically creating about 80% of the food and sustainability for the community. But the 20% that's coming from hunting is what we say is the most important, right? So it's interesting how our view and hierarchy of gender actually colors our interpretations of the past and how we understand this. Not to mention how our language and vocabulary reflects hierarchical systems of gender inequality. So there's some questions raised on page 265 of your chapter asking, what's the difference between a stud and a slut, right? Obviously the connotation, meaning the definition's the same. It's someone who has a lot of sex. But when a woman has a lot of sex, it's very negative. When a guy has a lot of sex, it's considered positive, right? So it just shows how there's a double standard when it comes to sexuality and the way that we expect men and women to express that sexuality. right? When you think about the words that we use to refer to women, right? Bitch, cow, heifer. These words that are related to animals, right? Basically calling them babies, calling them, a lot of terms that, mean either baby animals or just kind of connect them to being inferior as animals, right? Doll, sweetie pie, cupcake, sugar, right? All these kind of ways to really dismiss and diminish, women as a group. Also, when you think about, the way that language has been used to kind of make things common, make when it's supposed to be general to the entire population, it's considered man, right? Like mankind, man-made, manpower, right? Things like that that are really trying to, if I address the class, okay, you guys, that's considered appropriate. But if I say, okay, girls, let's get back to it, it could actually offend some of the men in the class. Though for women, they're pretty used to being called men or being called dude, guy, things like that in the general nomenclature that assumes maleness, right? So if you're a woman, you have to kind of be separate or extra, like steward is, right? Or things of that nature. So there are a lot of sociological theories that try to explain this, that we'll talk about in a moment. But it is interesting how language structures thought. So the way that language works is going to affect the way that we understand the rights or equality of these groups, right? So I was one of the first generations that grew up in this kind of like post second wave of the women's rights movement, where they tried to address some of these language deficits by creating more gender neutral terms for things so that they wouldn't be so exclusionary to women, especially in career fields. So you had the change from fireman to firefighter, policeman to, police officer, or mailman to postal worker, mail carrier, something like that. Largely because before that, you really couldn't identify a woman as a police officer or a woman as a firefighter or a woman as a postal worker, because the word man was already limiting who should be in that job just in your subconscious mind, in the way that language structures thought. So it's interesting to see how those things have changed, though. If you close your eyes and you think firefighter, you're still thinking of a man, or police officer, you're still thinking of a man oftentimes. But the idea is, as a result of those changes being made, there have been more inclusion for women in some of those roles. So it's interesting to see, when people say, oh, it's politically correct, or blah, you're policing the language, blah. Language is very important in the way that we actually can see and understand the world. So it makes sense that people would challenge language that's sexist, that's homophobic, that's, kind of creating barriers to equality. All right, so some of the different theories look at gender inequality and try and understand it. So functionalists believe that there are social roles that are better suited to one gender than the other, and the societies are more stable when certain tasks are done by one sex and the other, right? So that kind of using the binary system that we consider normative in our culture, right? Functionalists tend to believe that society functions the way it does as a result of having different roles and tasks. And so functionalists would likely agree that these differences result in inequalities, but they say that there's, a purpose for this in society. And mind you, Talcott Parsons was, coming up with this theory in the early 1900s, so that's not that surprising if it seems very sexist. So according to Talcott Parsons, men are more suited for instrumental roles and women are more suited for expressive roles. So instrumental roles are just the people who provide the family's material support, or are often the authority figures, while expressive roles are the people providing the family's emotional support and nurturing. So Parsons was a functionalist, and while it might be true that men and women have traditionally filled gender-specific roles, many contemporary theories argue that this is a result of our socialization, meaning the way we've been taught to behave, more so than some sort of biologically innate thing that leads us to certain roles. What's interesting is that when men have expressive roles, like they're caring and nurturing, and when women have instrumental roles and they're demanding and, we see them very differently, right? We see men as weak when they express themselves in expressive roles, and we see women as bitches when they express themselves in instrumental roles. So there's still a lot of this in the culture when it comes to the expectations for our behavior. Conflict theorists believe that men have historically had access to most of the society's material resources and privileges. Therefore, it's in their interest to try to maintain that dominant position. So conflict theorists point out that men stand to lose a great deal if gender inequality disappears. For example, they'd have to do more unpaid work. or have to pay to keep their homes kept up or children cared for. Conflict theorists are interested in the imbalances of power in society and the struggles that people go through in trying to gain access to power, to which they traditionally have not had access. So in many societies, it's clear that women have not had access to power and oftentimes still don't have access to power. So gender inequality can be found in past and present societies and often takes the form of patriarchy, which is just the kind of social organization of male domination. Interactionists, right, so symbolic interactionists who think that meaning is derived through interaction, emphasize how the concept of gender is socially constructed, maintained, and reproduced in our everyday lives when we interact with each other. So this just means that, what it means to be a man or a woman is something we express in the way that we talk, in the way that we eat, the way that we dress, the way that we do everything, and that it kind of cements those roles in practice when we interact. Because remember, the basis of social interaction is this kind of looking glass mirror idea that if we do things that are considered deviant, we're punished. If we do things that are considered, conforming, then we're rewarded. So when it comes to gender, if you conform to gender expectations, you will be rewarded for that. If you transgress those expectations, you will experience some sort of exclusion, stigma, or policing, right? We often do this to men quite a bit. When it comes to anything that they do that is considered at all feminine, we'll be like, man up, or, we'll use homophobic or sexist slurs, right, to police men into acting a certain way, right? So, don't be a this, don't be a that, which, again, you can fill in that blank with homophobic and misogynistic slurs. And so we often, are really hypercritical of men's performance of gender. So it's interesting, even though conflict theorists would say that because of a patriarchal system, men benefit because they're considered more trustworthy, they have more access to power, things like that. There's still a lot of ways the interaction would show that gender hurts men in a lot of ways because it doesn't allow them full expression of their real identities. They have to be very careful to not express themselves in ways that can leave themselves vulnerable to criticism or critique, right? Because then, in a male power structure that's all about hierarchy, it's easy to gain power by putting someone else down, by saying that they're weak, or again, insert homophobic or misogynistic slur to kind of police that behavior. So feminist theorists apply assumptions about gender inequalities to social institutions to illuminate how gender inequality affects all areas of social life. So their theories are really looking at how gender is shaped through the culture and our interactions with others. So the idea that gender is reproduced means that adults learn gender roles. They teach those roles to their children when they say act like a lady, or, walk it off, be a man, right? Things like that. They teach them those things to children, which then reinforce the gender norms that perpetuate or reproduce those gender roles in society. All right, so continuing on this understanding of socialization, gender, and sexuality is gender role socialization. So this is the lifelong process of learning to be masculine or feminine, primarily through those four main agents of socialization: our families, schools, peers, and the media. So families are usually the primary source of socialization for everything, so they greatly impact our gender role socialization. So children are exposed to their families as their primary agent. Oftentimes, this is the only group or socialization agent that they experience before they go to school. So if you think of gender socialization, you probably have a lot of experiences of that from your parents, from your families, telling you, if you're a girl, that you're supposed to be wearing dresses, that you're not supposed to be getting dirty, right? Or policing the kind of toys you play with, like if you're a boy and you want to play with dolls or things like that. There's often, many, many ways that these people in our lives, not because they're inherently sexist, but because they're just trying to help you fit into the expected roles in society. But in a way, they're still just reinforcing traditional gender roles. So social learning theory suggests that babies and children learn behaviors and meanings through social interaction and internalize the expectations around them. So according to social learning theory, children tend to mimic significant role models in their lives. For instance, if a boy sees his father working on the car, right? The boy looks up to his father and identifies with his father's biological sex. Therefore, the boy learns indirectly through observation that it's a man's job to work on the car. And he internalizes that expectation for himself as well. So in that way, the boy has experienced gender role socialization. So if you think about how you can identify specific examples of gender role socialization in your own life, you'll probably find many of them. For instance, Were you ever told that a specific behavior wasn't appropriate because you were a boy or a girl? Did you ever receive harsh or more lenient punishment because you were a boy or a girl? So oftentimes, if you really think about it, you can be hesitant to think about how, your life has been constructed by gender, but when you really start thinking about the way you act out your gender and how it's been socially constructed, you can really notice the differences in the ways that you've been treated versus others based on that socialization. So schools are, an important agent of socialization as well. When it comes to gender roles, oftentimes, children are socialized in schools to have gender roles that accord to their sex. So for instance, research shows that teachers treat boys and girls differently, and this may teach children that there's different expectations for them based on sex. So schools are generally the first agent of socialization that children experience outside of their immediate family. And this may be the first time that children are introduced to thoughts and ideas that contradict those of their families. So schools are very important agents of socialization, and the messages that students receive in schools can certainly have a big impact on the way that they think about themselves. So research shows that in school, teachers tend to favor boys in several ways. Boys receive more attention and instructional time, are more likely to be called on in class, are posed with more challenging questions or tasks, and are given more praise for the quality of their work. So what message does that send to the boys? But what message does that send to the girls, right? So it's important how teachers treat us that affects our own self-identity. So in Western societies, peer groups are an important agent of socialization. And so in our culture, teens are rewarded by their peers when they conform to gender norms and stigmatized when they don't. So in fact, many sociologists argue that peer groups are the most dominant agent of socialization once you hit middle school all the way through adulthood. So for example, as teens, boys tend to gain prestige through athletic ability, their sense of humor, or by taking risks and defying norms. Girls, on the other hand, tend to gain prestige through social position and their physical attractiveness. So while teens receive praise or punishment, they're learning what behaviors are acceptable for them based on their gender. So there's no question that sexual behavior is portrayed in a highly stereotypical manner in all forms of the media, which is another important agent of socialization. So television, movies, magazines, books, video games, so on. And this is what, the film deals with that you're dealing with in this class. So, we know that media impacts us, but there's much debate about how much we're actually impacted. So we can note that in recent decades, we've seen some interesting correlations. Female models have gotten thinner. Male actors have gotten more muscular. Both boys and girls are experiencing higher rates of depression, more cases of anorexia and bulimia, and greater issues with self-esteem and self-worth. However, there are some exceptions, right, that media coverage can be positive or transformative, but oftentimes because of the corporate consolidation of the media where, 90% of media is owned by 6 companies, the power and hegemony of those people that are rich and white and wealthy and male enough to own those companies or run those boards or be in charge of the content that's actually made affects the kind of perception of how those things are passed down through society. So if you're just reflecting the reality you see and you're only seeing your own reality, then you're not reflecting the actual reality of society. So sex and gender affect almost every significant aspect of our lives. Even our lifespan is different depending on sex. So females that were born in 2013 are expected to live an average of 81.2 years, while males are expected to live just 76.4 years. So women are really disadvantaged in a lot of institutional settings in our society. Compared to men, women are more likely to do a disproportionate amount of housework. In short, women are more likely to work what's called a second shift, a term coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild that refers to the unpaid work, such as cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, home repair, yard work, that must be done at home after the day's paid labor is complete. So if you think about a list of the household activities that are considered, quote, responsibilities of men, quote, or responsibilities of women, end quote, then think about how much time goes into each task and see who provides more unpaid labor in a typical household, right? So women also, compared to men, earn less than their male peers at work and are also more likely to live in poverty. This is the reality of what's called the feminization of poverty. So this refers to the economic trend that women are more likely than men to live in poverty, due in part to the gender gap in wages, the higher proportion of single mothers compared to single fathers, and the increasing, incredibly expensive costs of childcare. So the gender gap in wages has contributed in part to the feminization of poverty, but it's not the only thing, right? It's being a single parent, which is financially difficult. Having to provide childcare, healthcare, things like that for your children is just very expensive in our capitalistic society in a way that's just unprecedented in the world, right? We don't see in other countries these things are subsidized and taken care of, and therefore are much more affordable and accessible than they are in this country, right? So it becomes very difficult for someone that's a single parent to be able to support themselves, especially if they're making 70% of what a man would be making for the same job. So an important factor and something hint that'll be on your exam is the understandings of the women's movement. So the question I'm really looking for there are, what are the three waves of the women's rights movement? What were they characterized by, right? Like, what was the significance of each one? And what was the ideology that linked them together? In this case, feminism. Feminism is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of all people, right? So the social movement that's organized around the belief that people are equal. So in the U.S., the history of the women's movement can be divided into three historical waves. So the first wave is from the mid-19th century through 1920, and this focused on gaining suffrage for women, meaning the right to vote. So the first wave was the earliest period of feminist activism and included women who won the right to vote in 1920. So what's interesting is a lot of these women, they were also abolitionists, meaning that they were organizing in order to try to end the system of slavery in America. So what's interesting is these women were organizing and working towards ending slavery, and they realized they also didn't have rights. They also couldn't vote. They couldn't, be in elected office. They couldn't own property, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, they started organizing for their own rights, and that kind of, culminated with the 19th Amendment and the ability for women to vote. The second wave of the women's rights movement is characterized as the 1960s and 70s, and this focused on women's equal access to employment and education. So as long as you know that, you're good, but also this was a huge period of kind of political and social turmoil, the 60s and 70s. So this is when we got a lot of the rights that women take for granted today, such as birth control, access to abortion, right, the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. You also have, the kind of the free love movement of the late 60s that stopped completely associating sex with reproduction and saw that women also have a sexuality and should be able to have sex for pleasure and not just for reproduction. Also, again, equal employment in education, meaning there were a lot of higher education paths and schools that were just cut off to women, meaning you couldn't, get certain degrees because they weren't considered appropriate to women or open to women. There were many legal employment paths that were just legally restricted for women, meaning they were just jobs women couldn't do because they were a woman, not because they weren't, capable as a human person or intelligent enough, but just because as a society, women were not allowed to do those jobs. So this meant that women were very restricted. And for a long period of history, even up until this time period, the second wave, if women wanted to get a credit card, they had to get their husband or their father's approval. So that's something that kind of flies in the face of the expectations that young women have today of their own autonomy and rights and freedom. All of that comes from the second wave, right? So all those things we take for granted, like that you can go to school and that your programs will be equally funded, that comes from Title IX, that came from this time period, right? That, again, access to birth control, abortion, and family planning. Now think about just how important that is. If you can control when and if you have children, then that's obviously going to help you gain an education and also be able to get full-time employment in, that realm if you can control how many children you're having, right? So a lot of that movement is focused on, kind of getting women equality within those realms. And then the third wave is from the 1980s to present, though I argue that actually ended a couple of years back and we're in the fourth wave, but whatever, no one cares what I think. So this focus on diversity among women's experiences and identities. So the second wave, if there's a lot of criticisms of it, it's often what nowadays is called white feminism, meaning focusing on the issues that affect white middle-class women without really taking into account poor women, women of color, disabled women, lesbians, men, or other groups that are also affected by the systems of gender. So the third wave is the most recent, and it really looks at the variety and diversity of identities the women possess. So there's a men's movement that sprung from this, that the what's called the male liberationism that originated in the 70s to discuss the challenges of masculinity. And so you have those creepy MRA guys, those men's rights guys, but the reality is the pro-feminist men's movement is actually much stronger. It just doesn't get the same kind of like hateful knowledge on the internet. But there's many pro-feminist men that understand that the system of gender doesn't help them either. It really restricts how they act, what they're able to do, how they're able to kind of even feel if you can't even cry in front of people because you'll be considered weak, right? So a lot of ways in the third wave, it's much more broadly sympathetic with feminism. This idea that not just women in the U.S. are important, not just men in the U.S., but people around the world are important, that we should see the exploitation and inequality of people within, just through this lens of gender, to see how the system of gender privileges some people and diminishes others. So this is much more connected to what we've talked about with intersectionality, right? Connecting social class, race, nationality, age, ability, disability, all those kind of things to the experiences of gender, to see that you can't say all men experience blank or all women experience blank, because how you experience being a man or a woman matters by your age, by your social class, by your race, by your sexuality, all of those things. So it makes it much more complicated, right?